Tonight we're very pleased to have with us Mr. Allan T. Shulman and Building Bacardi. Richly illustrated with vintage, powerfully graphic, and often glamorous imagery, Building Bacardi tells the story of the iconic brand's love affair with high design. Bacardi is best known for its rum and its trademark back logo, yet the famed spirits company has also been a force in the development of avant-garde art and architecture. True to the company's slogan, Bacardi has asserted its corporate identity through buildings designed by a potent mix of modern architects with varying, sometimes radically different approaches to architecture. Corporate headquarters, distilleries, bottling plants, and executives' private homes have shaped and reflected Bacardi's position as a regional upstart, a national icon, and a global corporation with outposts in such places as Bermuda, Brazil, Cuba, Mexico, and the United States. Building Bacardi is the first book to explore the 20th century architectural legacy of the company. Allan T. Shulman is an architect and the founder of Miami-based Shulman & Associates. His work is widely published and has been honored with more than 60 design awards. Shulman is also an author, editor, lecturer, curator, and associate professor of the University of Miami School of Architecture. Let's give him a big round of applause. Allan T. Shulman.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to begin by thanking Books and Books for the invitation, and I'd also like to thank Bacardi, and in particular Ora Reinhardt, who really helped make the archives and the facilities of Bacardi open for my research. First, I'll start by saying I don't know very much about mixed drinks, but I did become a mojito drinker in the process of doing this research, which was actually very good. My interest begins with that extraordinary, audacious, modern building that Bacardi built in the 1960s on Biscayne Boulevard. And it's a building that around 2010, I included in an anthology of post-war modern architecture in Miami called Miami Modern Metropolis. And that was an essay by a friend and colleague, Gray Reed. And so that kind of began the process of sort of bringing to light a little bit the history of that building. And then an exhibition project rolled around a couple years later. And it was actually provoked by a change of Bacardi's location within the geography of Miami, because when Bacardi decided to leave that incredible complex on Biscayne Boulevard and move to Coral Gables, that arose the interest of the Coral Gables Museum, which was just completed maybe the year before. The Coral Gables Museum, which is right next door to Books and Books. And so in the process of putting together that exhibition, I was able to sort of round out a story. And what is the story of Bacardi? Well, you know, most people know or knew that Bacardi commissioned important works by Mies van der Rohe and by Felix Candela too. These are two very important modernist architects. Those buildings had been widely published, and they are kind of icons of modern architecture, icons of corporate architecture. But what I realized in putting this story together is that there's a lot more to the story than Mies van der Rohe and Felix Candela. In fact, their work is embedded in a long and continuous story of architecture and identity making that goes back about 100 years. And in fact, that story is embedded in an even more important story, a very interesting story of a company, a family, a country, world history, because Bacardi is intermingled with all of those stories. So it's a very engaging story. And much has been written about Bacardi. When I started this exhibition, Tom Gelton had just finished his book, Bacardi and the Long Struggle for Cuba, or Long Fight for Cuba. But this was an opportunity to really look at the architectural legacy of the company. And it's important because Bacardi was a company that always considered architecture part of its storytelling and part of its brand management. And see if I get this right. Okay. These are images of the exhibition that opened in 2012 at the Coral Gables Museum. In the front is a top built by Cuban artist Alexandra Arachea and brought in for the exhibition. It features the Bacardi building in Havana on top of a top. And Bacardi has always been sort of expert at telling its own story as well. Bacardi maintains museums, often called Casa Bacardi, in many of its homes around the world. But what I think might be interesting as a way of starting would be to talk about how the company really, we could look at these buildings as allegories. The company looked at these buildings as allegories, and that's a story that can be told through a series of postcards. And here on the very left is one of the company's first advertising efforts, and it was a postcard published during the time of the American invasion in 1898, and meant to be used by Americans to send back to the States as a sort of a secondary advertisement of Bacardi products. But what it does is it features all of the buildings of Bacardi and also all of the principal landmarks of Santiago, Cuba. But you can see in their postcards this idea of sort of pride of the industrial prowess of the company, its technological know-how, its attention to hygiene and to quality, its civic pride, its pride in sort of monumentality and political engagement, its modernity or progressivism, and all of these sort of qualities come together in the story of Bacardi and its architecture. Now, the book explores the architecture of Bacardi through four what I call terrestrial paradigms, four ways of looking at the company in relationship to the places in which it operated. And the first has to do with what I call the local paradigm, which is when the company is founded in 1862. It is a local or regional company. It is a small regional distiller in Santiago de Cuba. The innovation of Bacardi is that Facundo Bacardi, the founder, found a way using chemistry to distill rum to a very high quality, a very consistent quality, and a very light, clear rum, so that it was a rum that could be, that sort of counteracted the bad associations with rum, that it was too strong or it had a bad taste. But it was also a rum that could be mixed with other drinks. And so that was sort of the principal innovation that launched the company. I love these two images because they're the first two distilleries of Bacardi. And they illustrate two basic types of buildings that you would find in Santiago before the modern era. On the left, a kind of vernacular shed structure, which was a kind of early industrial building, which was located outside the city, outside the colonial center. And the second, a building within the colonial center on the right, and which eventually became Bacardi's home. And into the 20th century, Bacardi became quite interested in using architecture, new types of architecture, as a way of sort of declaring itself, its modernity. The building on the left was a new plant that's sort of inspired by the World Exposition of 1915 in San Diego and its industrial buildings, and it has the prominent figure of bats all around the cornice, as you can see, maybe you can see, and then of course that rum bottle water tower, which is a landmark, and the first president of Bacardi is Facundo's son, Emilio Bacardi Moreau, who is an important figure because he doesn't just run the company. He's an important politician. He becomes the mayor of Santiago at a very important time right after the Spanish-American War. He is a chronicler of Santiago's history. He's a poet. He's a politician. So he's a guy who mixes, let's say, entrepreneurial qualities with civic responsibilities, which kind of sets a tone for future Bacardi endeavors. But this is a museum that is built upon Emilio's death by his widow, and it's the first museum in Cuba, and it's a sort of very imposing classical temple-like structure. And he also assembled the collection within. As we move into the 1920s and 1930s, Bacardi becomes really the most important industry in Cuba. And at that point, the paradigm changes from local or regional to national. Bacardi is a Cuban company. Bacardi is a Cuban icon. Many people know Bacardi as Cuba. And the postcard on the left is a relic of Prohibition. It basically shows sort of that Bacardi partly grew by attracting Americans to Havana, where they could have a great time and drink liberally. And on the right, the Americas agree on Bacardi. That's a play on Roosevelt's new politics of the Americas in the 1930s. Bacardi not only commissions, but they actually launch a competition to design a new Bacardi building for Havana. It's a very interesting project, principally because Bacardi actually isn't based in Havana. They didn't really need to have anything in that building. They just wanted a marker in Havana. So the building is an office building that was basically a commercial office building to rent out to other people. And the principal place for Bacardi in the building is in the ground floor, and they create a bar, an exhibition bar. And this is the beginning of a very important type for Bacardi, which is the kind of demonstration bar where you can sample all the Bacardi products, learn how to mix drinks. It was a very important sales tool. And this building, with all of its lush Art Deco detailing, it's an extraordinary Art Deco building with these sculptural motifs, bas-relief, that are reputed to be the work of Maxfield Parrish, the American illustrator Maxfield Parrish. This sort of coloring, exotic use of marbles and metals, mix of modern elements with authentic Cuban elements like persianas and metal screens over the windows. This building was in fact mainly a kind of a foyer for the bar. The rest of it was for rent. So this is a view of the lobby on the left, and the sort of vestibule of the bar, the entrance sort of room, or the foyer on the right. So, Bacardi during this time advertises itself as a Cuban product, not a product of Santiago, and very proudly so. And when Prohibition ends, they promptly build a bar in New York City. This is in the old New York Club, which was a very elegant room space building. And this bar by Morris Sanders, architect Morris Sanders, but with these beautiful murals that run around the room by an artist named Gropper, who was a kind of social realist painter, illustrating how rum is produced and the sort of the context from which it comes. It was basically to establish an atmosphere for Bacardi in New York, to reintroduce people to Bacardi products. You may remember that, or know that during the Depression or during the Prohibition, rum was synonymous with kind of evil. So the idea was to reintroduce people to the products and to the sociability of drinking in a social atmosphere, in a great social space. Bacardi did another space in New York, and New York was, of course, an important center for spirits um, right after Prohibition. And this one by an architect named Franklin Hughes was on the 35th floor of the Empire State Building, and it had these wonderful murals by an artist named Gatorno. Those artists basically showed a scene from the Cuban country, from the countryside, sugar production. But it was a kind of just a salon for entertaining, inspired by the products of Bacardi. Sorry. And I think it's interesting, these two advertisements, because they speak to two images that Bacardi was promoting. And the one on the right jumps forward a little bit. But on the one hand, on the left, to the United States, an image of fun, of pleasures, of the tropics, the perfume of the tropics. And on the right, this is the Cuban hero Jose Marti. It's basically an advertisement celebrating his life, 1850. His centenary of his birth, I believe. So it's an advertisement with a political undertone that is very important. And while we're speaking of politics, it's interesting to note that on the bottom right hand, you see the logo of Hatuey and the name Hatuey. And Hatuey was also an important Cuban figure, a Native American who resisted Spanish conquest, and was kind of an inspirational figure for those like the Bacardi who believed in the independence of Cuba. I want to jump forward to the post-war period, and something happened in the post-war period. Bacardi had already been building buildings throughout, of course, Cuba, but also in Puerto Rico and Mexico as they expanded their business and became an international company. So, really the post-war is about the sort of internationalization of Bacardi. And in doing all of that work, they largely hired a group of local architects, Cuban architects, Puerto Rican architects, Mexican architects. But at a certain point, they, in 1956, Pepin Bosch, who was the third president of Bacardi, had the idea of using international architectural stars to design Bacardi buildings to sort of increase the visibility of the buildings. But before he did this is a home that he designed for himself. This is the American architect Philip Johnson, who designed this incredibly airy birdcage-like home that would have been built on the beach at Veradero, literally on the beach. And the home was interesting because the ground floor was all of the enclosed bedrooms, and then above was just a large open bird cage of a room that was not. There were no windows. It was just screened with a kind of a persiana wall that went up like 30 feet to these beautiful concrete vaults at the top, sort of at a very important time for Philip Johnson in his career, because he was just coming out of his engagement with the international style and with sort of a more Miesian brand of modern architecture. All of a sudden, here he is designing these conical vaults and this very romantic structure. And it was probably through Philip Johnson that Bosch eventually connected with Mies van der Rohe, who designed the company's headquarters building in Santiago. And it's an extraordinary effort. It is said that Bosch hired Mies because Bosch's idea of how a corporation should be run was very modern. I mean, he believed in the corporation. He was a corporate man. And he believed that the corporation was transparency. It was openness, that everybody should be in one room all together with no apparent hierarchies. Of course, all those who sat next to him, had a hard time. But so he would sit in these large rooms full of tables. So Mies designed this structure, which is a one-story open glass prism covered by this oversailing concrete, like egg crate concrete roof, suspended on only 8 columns, 2 on each side of the building. And then within that space, a series of walls pivoted and began to kind of create divisions within the space. But this building made the cover of pretty much every architectural journal, and it wasn't even built. It was such an important building. I mean, it was one of the chief building types within Mises' oeuvre. And this is a diagram of the structural concept of the building by Mises' office, basically showing those 8 columns and that big roof. And this building would have a long history even after the project fell through, because it did fall through. I mean, it was the design was finished in '57. Bosch was having trouble with the president Batista at the time. Batista and the Bacardi didn't get along at all, so he was waiting for Batista to be ousted. And of course, Bacardi was a supporter of Fidel Castro initially in that effort. And then when Castro came in, things also didn't work out, and Bacardi, well, that's the next part of the story, leaving the island. But so the building was never realized. But it was realized, because it was realized, it was proposed again for a city in Germany. That project was never realized, and then it was proposed again for the new museum in Berlin, where it was finally built. It is an extraordinary structure built in steel instead of concrete, the way it would have been done in Santiago, and more appropriate for the tropics. This is a collage view of the interior, showing what it would have been like to be in that space, in that sandwich of space, with the views all around and these sort of intervening partitions and walls. And by the way, this openness was made possible by burying all the stuff you didn't want to see. You know, the bathrooms, the cores, the mechanical stuff, the storage were all underground. And the building was lifted on a plinth. So it's a very classical building. Another big effort of Bacardi in the 1940s was the modernization of their facilities in Puerto Rico. So they had moved into Puerto Rico immediately after the end of Prohibition to kind of establish an American flag for their operation. So, you know, so to not have to go through customs, if it was made in Puerto Rico, it would be an American product. But of course, many of the distillers in Puerto Rico opposed Bacardi, and Bacardi made a lot of efforts to kind of overcome that opposition with a lot of really great architecture and sort of commitment, civic commitment. But this is the primary building of the new distillery campus that was built on the edge of San Juan, outside of San Juan, in a place called Cataño. And it's a very monumental structure. This is actually a distillery wrapped in a sort of modern classical building. Looks like it could be a WPA project or something in the state. Could be a civic building of some sort. It's in a very prominent location. You can see beneath the arches of that concrete shelter the Moro, the fortress in San Juan. So it's right at the entrance to San Juan Harbor, very prominent location, but outside the city. And it was really the beginning of this trend of building industrial campuses outside of cities in suburban locations. This structure, in the style of Felix Candela, was actually designed by SACMAG, which was a very important Havana-based firm, kind of vertically integrated with planning, architecture, engineering, interior design, programming, and did many of Bacardi's works in Cuba. But they were brought in as the executive architect, and this shelter is made up of, it's a type of hyperbolic paraboloid structure, a very thin shell, only like 3 inches thick, but covering a very large space. And it's basically just a bar, an outdoor bar, a place to enjoy drinks on the edge of the bay. At the Puerto Rican complex, they also built a museum for the company. And I mentioned that they had built museums in many of their complexes. But this is a sort of modern museum by an architect named Miguel Rosich. And it's also incorporates the idea of these kind of conical vaults that Philip Johnson had also proposed for Bosch in his house projects. And then on the walls of the plants are murals by a Spanish artist, a Catalan artist named Rosalia Pujol, that basically celebrated the flora and fauna of Puerto Rico and of San Juan. So, this story of how the company adapts itself to new locations, to new cultural contexts is actually very important and embedded in the buildings. Probably the most dramatic modern campus of Bacardi is in Mexico, or two campuses in Mexico, in fact. The first was the Distillery that was built near Puebla in a place called La Galarza. It's an old sugar-producing region of Mexico, and you really sense Bacardi is creating this kind of network of sugar producing, that's linking this network of sugar producing regions all over the Caribbean and all over the Americas in their development. This plant is designed, the plant itself is designed by Felix Candela, a Spanish emigre who came during the Spanish Civil War to Mexico and specialized in the design of thin shell concrete vaults. And he designs a series of very interesting, very functional vaults. He builds them as well. For Bacardi. But one of the interesting things about this project is that he kept the old hacienda, sugar-producing hacienda that was, that was on the site already, and this was before historic preservation movements. This is an act of conservation that is really, let's say, it was unsolicited, at least. But it had to do with the idea that this plant was going to be more than just an industrial plant. It was going to be a place. It was going to be a visitor center. It was going to be a retreat for the family. And so this idea of always sort of making multiple use of a single project is very important in Bacardi's history. And multiple objectives, not just doing the one simple functional thing, but thinking about a few things and thinking about how their identity links to all of those things. And then outside Mexico City, in a place called Tultitlan, he built, this is also Felix Candela, a bottling plant. And this is the most important part of the bottling plant, which is the bottling hall. Which are these great hyperbolic paraboloid vaults, inspired by the St. Louis airport by Minoru Yamasaki a couple years earlier. Candela says it inspired him, but much better than that airport, because that airport has really heavy, heavy concrete arches, and this is very light and very minimalist. And the glass is maximal. It runs, all the way between, not just between the vaults, but it runs also between the vaults on the interior of the building, creating a very extraordinary interior space. And then the other type that Candela used, because Candela used these Bacardi projects to just create all kinds of different vault experiments, concrete experiments. These were umbrellas, which he had sort of developed, and they were like umbrellas that are flipped upside down, so that in fact they catch water, and the water is then fed to cisterns that feed the plant as well. But by tipping those umbrellas, he introduces skylights too, and he just creates them one by one and encloses vast areas of factory. But another weird story here is that right next to Felix Candela's plant is Mies van der Rohe's administration building. And Mies never succeeded in completing the administration building in Santiago, but here in Mexico it was built, and it was his first and really only completed building in Latin America. And it has been sometimes criticized as sort of a piece of the Seagram building, but it's a very elegant building, and in fact, it incorporates something of the idea of the original Santiago building. It's raised up so that the main office area is on the upper level, and the whole ground floor is glass here, and sort of open to the landscape. Here. And that's the interior. And you sort of come into this lower level, and you walk up these stairs, and you're in this this great space that looks out over the whole complex. You know, just as a sort of coda to this era, Bacardi was an international company. You know, they were in Mexico, they were in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in Martinique, they were in Brazil already by that time, in Recife. And this is a page out of a magazine, a Bacardi company magazine that tried to pull everything back together into a cohesive corporate culture, basically, to try to elaborate that Bacardi cultural tradition in a different way. Again, this is from an advertisement or a book by Bacardi, and just talking about its different facilities, and you know, many facilities, many places, one company. But with the Cuban Revolution and a year later the nationalization of its properties, Bacardi left Cuba, and when it left Cuba, it became really a different type of international corporation. It became a transnational corporation, but one with with no exact home. It's more like an archipelago of places. And Pepin Bosch basically flew on his private plane between all these different locations, visiting. He had a home in each installation, and visited this archipelago continuously, maintaining operations. But at the time of its largest crisis, with most of its properties sort of no longer under their control, a big hit to the company's finances and its assets, Bosch decided in Miami to create something very important, to create a statement of will to survive, to kind of align himself with the Cuban diaspora that had also come to Miami, and to kind of show leadership within that diaspora. And he commissions SACMAG, now relocated to Puerto Rico, to design this incredible building on Biscayne Boulevard. And there's so many things one can say about this building, but you know, one of the things that I find so extraordinary about it is the audaciousness of the structure, first of all, because in the service of making it as light and as almost effortlessly like levitating as possible, it is built on 4 columns, only 4 piers at the base that rise to the top, where you can see trusses that basically the building is hung from those trusses. All that to basically liberate the ground floor and to create a grand plaza in front of the building. As far as I know, that was probably the first plaza in Miami. And then the other thing that's extraordinary about the building is that on the east side and part of the west side, it has this Seagram building, Mies van der Rohe glass facade that's very corporate, modern, you know, feeling. But on the ends of the building, which had to be solid in order to stabilize this incredibly light structure, are these murals by the Brazilian muralist Francisco Brenand, of a kind of a fantastical Pan-American foliage, basically also telling the story of Bacardi as a Pan-American corporation. So that type of hybridity between, you know, 2 different types of modern, or one could say between a very straight-laced corporate modern and a very exotic tropical modern, is, you know, are just expertly joined here. And the, sorry, this is a little sticky. Okay. All right. Well, the interior of the this is the lobby of the building with this pretty incredible carpet wall mural at one end that basically is the story of a cocktail. Bacardi is all about telling stories with its architecture and design. This is the annex of the building built about 10 years later behind, which has a similar structural system. It's raised on this center mushroom-like pylon, and then it spreads from there, and it's actually hung from trusses on the roof. But the extraordinary thing about this building is that they took these paintings that were commissioned by Bosch from a German artist named Johannes Maria Dietz, and basically translated them through a French mosaic glass artist named the Laver brothers into the facades of the building. And this is an architect named Carrera Justice that did this building for Bosch. And from what we know about Bosch, Bosch was the inspiration of all of these moves. He basically inspired the architects to do these things because he was a guy who traveled a lot. He had seen many international ways of building architecture. Those murals on the side of the Bacardi building in Miami are reminiscent of the library at the National University of Mexico, UNAM, that were built just a few years earlier. In the 1970s, Bacardi commissions two major office building projects. This is for its headquarters in Bermuda, new headquarters. They had moved the corporation for various reasons to Bermuda. And if it looks familiar, does it look familiar? It's because it's a kind of a reiteration of the original Mies design, but in a completely different way. And on the interior, nothing of Mies or of Mies's brand of modernism. This was by an artist, an interior designer named Maria Bergson, who mixed kind of warm traditional furnishings with Knoll, and then these very particular carpets, all designed to basically highlight Bacardi's various locations within the Americas. And then SOM is commissioned about a year later to design a headquarters for the Puerto Rican complex, which is almost the same idea of this large oversailing roof carried on columns with glass box underneath, but this one actually sits on a berm. So there are recurrent ideas in this Bacardi architecture. It's beginning to be introspective or reflective, in a sense, to look back on its own history by the 1970s, perhaps as an act of nostalgia, but one could also say as an act of cultural, of engagement with its own history. And then I'll just end with, the last or latest phase, I should say, of Bacardi architecture, which is the development of brand homes throughout the world. And in the 1990s, Bacardi came into it. Bacardi had been actually many companies that were all assimilated into one company, and then that company purchased other companies, other liquor brands, spirits brands throughout the world, and became a conglomerate, basically, of many different brands. So Bacardi was no longer just a rum company, but Bacardi was a spirits company. And in order to promote, with this sort of more complex identity, in order to promote the authenticity of its various products, they build these brand homes, not with any reference to Bacardi, but to the regions in which they're founded. And this is a brand home near Cognac in France, and it's for the Grey Goose brand, and it's a French-made vodka, and it was actually invented in this region by a vintner whose background is in the making of cognac. And they purchased a chateau. And in that chateau, they created both a kind of a boutique hotel for guests to come and stay and learn and experience the product, and And this is the dining room of the boutique hotel. And they also created a kind of an educational experience, but where you actually learn about the wheat, which is the same wheat from which they make baguettes in Paris, and you learn about the chemical processes, and you learn about how everything works, and you speak with the people who are the master distillers, and so it's this incredibly intense brand experience, and it all happens in a beautiful and well-designed sort of location, very remote location in Cognac in France. And the second one I want to show you is the Laver Stoke mill outside of London. This mill was where for centuries British banknotes were produced. But in the mid-20th century, they were moved to a more modern facility somewhere else, and this facility stood empty. And Bacardi purchased it and turned it into a home for Bombay Sapphire, which is which is one of their gin brands. And in transforming this location, they renovated the existing buildings. They restored the landscape, which had been in a lot of distress around it, and sort of made everything sustainable and green. And created this kind of very particular experience. So you walk through these brick buildings, it's a little bit like you're in a loft or something. All of the structures are open on the inside, and their distilling processes are exposed. These are greenhouses. This is by Thomas Heatherwick, British London-based architect. All of the greenhouses are basically where the botanicals that are used in Bombay Sapphire are grown. Not they're used in production, but for the experience of visitors are grown. You can see them in the ground, and then you can go next door and you can actually crush each botanical and smell it, and you can decide which botanicals you like the most and chart that, and the whole thing is guided by microchips that sort of track what your preference, where you've been, what your preferences are, and then when you get to the end, you go to the bar and they make you a custom cocktail. But this is all really part of the experience of this extraordinary place. And I find it quite refreshing the way they restored the historic buildings, but they also added new layers that really declare their presence in this historic complex in sort of a new way. So, what could be taken from this story of Bacardi? Oh, sorry, one last picture. This is part of the environmental performance of the building, which is very high, very green. The heat from those greenhouses is basically funneled in and funneled out, depending on the needs from the actual factory itself, from the plants, so that it keeps the equivalent temperature, the heat is reused, etc. So what can we learn? Well, I think Bacardi is such a compelling story because, for one thing, it kind of challenges what we understand about corporate architecture. For one thing, Bacardi never codified a Bacardi style. I mean, quite the opposite. They were very adventurous in their use of architecture and styling, but we sort of assume that a corporation would codify itself in a type of architecture. They explored a range of building types. They did corporate headquarters, they did industrial campuses, they did museums for the company, they did bars and brand homes. They experimented with all the types of architecture that businesses were building in the post-war period. They also had employed a concept of home in all of these buildings. So, they begin with their home in Santiago, and then their home really is a more complex story when Bacardi becomes a national icon of Cuba, because their home is kind of in that Bacardi building in Havana, but it's really in Santiago. And then when they go international, there are, of course, many homes. The corporate home is, in fact, never built by Mies van der Rohe, the dramatic corporate home. So this idea of home, and then there's brand homes of the contemporary period. So it's a very flexible concept of home. And it's also a very flexible concept of architecture that adapts to new homes, that can adapt to new places and new ideas. So I find that very interesting. And then, they worked across a range, across the spectrum of architecture, of modern architecture, purist monumentality, functionalism, expressionism, exoticism, and then, of course, hybrids of all those things all in one building. They were really kind of a master of hybridity, which goes very well with their motto in the 1960s, which was Bacardi, the mixable one, of course, having to do with the fact that Bacardi was a mixer. They were able to build new buildings and do acts of conservation and preservation. They were one of the first corporations to do that. And somehow in all of this story, we see the capacity of architecture to speak and to communicate and to be more than just buildings. In this inventory of work, notions of synthesis, pluralism, flexibility, respect for heritage, and the importance of myth and play commingle with functional necessities. It's a compelling story, not just of corporate architecture, but of architecture generally. So I was really glad to be able to dive into that, and thank you very much.
Folks, I'm sure we have a couple of questions, but if you do have a question, let me get to you with this microphone so that they can hear you on the internet. You have a couple of questions? Anyone? There we go.
Are they still building any of the corporate houses, or what is their status today as far as the architecture goes?
Bacardi has not built, as far as I know, new corporate headquarters. And I must say that this story that I'm telling in this book is really the story of the Americas. It's a Pan-American story, so it really spans, and then at the end with some brand homes in Europe. Bacardi did expand to Asia, into other places, and probably has built some recent new structures, but they were not part of the story. I really thought that the brand homes was sort of a good way to really look at the company's contemporary record. One thing they have done, is to build a new corporate headquarters in Coral Gables, just a few blocks away, which is on Lejeune, off Lejeune, and sorry? Yeah, on the outside it is nondescript. On the inside, it is really Bacardi. It has, in fact, all of the memory of Bacardi is somehow incorporated to the interiors of the building, with references to practically everything you see on these slides, on the walls, all over the place. When you walk into the building, it's interesting because you walk through this sort of corridor and then you enter a kind of a glass room that is animated by blue and white tile works that are very similar to the ones on the Miami Biscayne Boulevard Bacardi building. So it definitely has a Bacardi identity on the interior. They also in that building have a great archive, which I made use of very heavily in this project. Yes. Sorry.
Can you talk more about the buildings on Biscayne Boulevard, and if you know the history of when did, I guess in the early 60s, Bacardi moved headquarters from Puerto Rico or Cuba to here, and did they go right into those buildings? You said they were built 10 years apart.
So before the 90s, Bacardi there were many Bacardi corporations, and that was a kind of a structure that was invented, I think, by Pepin Bosch as a way of kind of ensuring against the kind of problems that he had in Cuba. So, for instance, the Bacardi Imports was the company in the U.S., and Bacardi Imports was based in New York. Bacardi Imports had the sole exclusive rights to distribute Bacardi in the United States. It's one of the reasons that after the Cuban Revolution that the government in Cuba couldn't sell Bacardi products on the exterior of the country was that they couldn't make use of that brand because all of these corporate structures were the sole authorized sellers of Bacardi products. So Bacardi Imports was based in New York. In '63, the idea was to move it to Miami, to basically be the new home of Bacardi in some way. Not the official home, because the official home for business and tax reasons was in Bermuda, first in Bahamas and then in Bermuda. But Miami, in a way, remains the home for many members of the Bacardi family. And that building was meant to kind of very symbolically show that. It was built, that area of Biscayne Boulevard where it was built, you may not think too much of it today, but it was kind of the modern extension of Miami at that time. IBM, NCR, all these like brand, blue brand American corporations were located on Biscayne Boulevard going north. So by putting that building there, that was also a kind of a declaration of, Bosch always believed in, he really believed in the corporation as a model organization, and the modern corporation, the kind of, very structured, very correct, that would be the type of corporation banks and other companies that collaborate with Bacardi could believe in and work with. So he established that, the building is part of making that argument. In fact, I would say that it also takes something from the Seagram building in New York, and not just its kind of glass facade in one direction, but the Seagram building was likewise built by the Bronfman family to kind of to bring the company out of the shadows of prohibition and make it a modern corporation by hiring the lead architect in the modern movement internationally, by building this glass and steel, this elegant glass and steel skyscraper right on Park Avenue. That was a declaration of modernity and belonging to the modern world. And I think Bosch was inspired in a similar way. I think that's one of the reasons he worked with Mies in Santiago. But when that didn't go through, he worked with his old friends at SACMAG, Enrique Gutierrez and Raul Alvarez, to design that building on Biscayne Boulevard. Other questions?
The picture on the cover of the book is the Bacardi building in Havana, correct? Do you know what year that picture was taken?
That picture is taken by a great architect and friend, Ken Treister, who has spoken in this room also many times, I believe. And Ken Treister is, in addition to being an architect, a photographer, and visited Havana maybe 10 or 12 years ago and produced a very good series of pictures. Of course, there weren't many pictures of the building. There were pictures, some pictures from the 1920s, but not really any great photography. And then all of a sudden, Ken Treister took these great shots, really bringing the building back to life. I should mention that, because Bacardi left Cuba very quickly, many of the archives are still there, I would imagine. The archives here are quite good, but they're limited in some ways, and by that fact. And so we didn't, we had a couple good pictures from the 1920s when it was completed. It was, the building was, the competition winner was a very important Cuban architect named Rodriguez Castells and Rafael Fernandez Ruenes. These were two architects. That competition drew the cream of Cuban architects in the 1920s. These were architects who were probably, the first modernizing architects at the time. They were engaged in bringing in new building types, modern building types to Havana, commercial building types, let's say. And the building, in fact, I didn't mention it, but it might be interesting that it may remind you of something. Is that building? It looks to me very much like those buildings by Schultz and Weaver, like the Biltmore Hotel, the Freedom Tower, and the Roni Plaza Hotel. And it's a kind of a, in this case, it's a kind of an office, a corporate office, a modern corporate office building built in steel, rising several stories off the street, but with a tower that is like that Giralda Tower, that imitation of the Giralda Tower in Spain, which is, and it's not just Schultz and Weaver in Miami, it's architects all over the country were using that motif in modern commercial buildings. I'm thinking of like the Cleveland Tower in Cleveland, or maybe it's the Wrigley Building in in Chicago. All over America are these corporate, modern 1920s office buildings that incorporate that tower motif in the same way. So, and it's interesting. The number 2 runner-up for the prize was a Gothic revival structure that looked for all the world like the Tribune Tower, as designed for Chicago. I forget the name of the architect of the Tribune Tower, but. So it's really evocative of that moment in the 1920s where modern architecture and the architecture of business, of corporate, business, was sort of moving across the world and creating new waves in a sense. But the styling is very Art Deco. It turns out to be very Art Deco. That's not, that's a more mixed story of French and other influences.
Folks, we have time for one more question right here.
Do we know how that building is being used today?
I've heard that it is basically offices for rent, as it has always been. The bar is still there. The ground floor is used the way it has always been used, as kind of a foyer. Let me just see here. So this is the lobby today. It was restored about, I'm going to guess here, about 15 years ago, pretty well. Although I've heard it's now in need of more restoration. And that space, which is the kind of main foyer on the right, is used sometimes for exhibitions. There's a stair from there that leads up to this very cozy mezzanine bar that is reminiscent of a kind of a speakeasy, because that's probably what Americans coming to Havana were understood as being kind of the right atmosphere for a bar in the 1920s, was a speakeasy. So it's in this huge building with these grand public spaces on the ground floor, the bar is like a little nook carved out of the mezzanine. You have to go up a little stair to get there. And it's all still there. It's still a bar. The building's still an office building, as far as I know.
The tower last year, up at the very top, and it's an amazing vantage point
To the city.
Havana and the destruction of how it looks now. We all
Yeah.
commented on it. Looks like Beirut.
Yeah.
The top of that tower. So.
Yeah, and it's. I should mention also the building was placed in a very interesting location. It's right near all the things that were happening in the 20s with the new Cuban, sort of republic. There was the creation of the Prado, the new Capitol building, like a bunch of important civic buildings were all built in that same location, but it still dominates the skyline and is a landmark. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Allan. Folks, before we close, I'd just like to let you know that the books are for sale behind the counter over here. If you're watching online, give us a call. We'll get one signed. If as you rise, you can fold your chairs, Allan will be sitting right over here signing. Don't forget to join us. We got live music coming up. We got our great restaurant. We got beer and we got wine. hang out at Books and Books tonight. Thank you so much for coming. Can we get another round of applause for our author, please? Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.